The ethical conduct of big pharmaceutical companies in developing countries continues to be under question, particularly in the height of the COVID-19 pandemic, where people were losing lives. These companies lived up to their decades-old accusation of prioritizing profits above human lives. And South Africa was not spared. Good evening and welcome to Unfiltered. I'm Sizwe Mpofu-Walsh. Last month, through a court judgment, activists were able to access the take-it-or-leave-it COVID vaccination contracts signed by the South African government, in which it agreed to unfavourable conditions and was overcharged compared to Western countries. Why did the government sign those contracts? And what recourse do developing countries have against the bullying tactics of pharmaceutical companies? Joining me for this conversation via Zoom are Dr. Nicholas Crisp, Deputy Director General for NHI from the National Department of Health, Candice Sehoma, Advisor Access Campaign Advocacy for Doctors Without Borders, and founder of the Health Justice Initiative, Fatima Hassan. We did extend invitations to both Pfizer and Johnson & Johnson, but they were yet to respond. But first, before we commence our discussion, let's gain perspective with this insert by Skangiwe Tiane.
We felt like we were beggars when it came to vaccine availability, when we felt we needed access to vaccines, and the northern countries had bought all the vaccines in the world and they were hogging them. And they didn't want to release them at the time when we needed them most. And let me tell you something that generated a lot of resentment.
President Cyril Ramaphosa lamenting the treatment African countries, more especially South Africa, experienced during the height of the COVID-19 pandemic when it came to securing vaccination shots. In 2020, more than 170 world leaders, including the heads of state of South Africa, Pakistan, Senegal, and Ghana, issued a call for a people's vaccine in the run-up to the World Health Assembly of that year. They demanded that all COVID vaccines, treatments, and tests be patent-free, mass-produced, distributed fairly, and made available to all people in all countries free of charge. A cry that fell on deaf ears as pharmaceutical companies like Pfizer went on to sell their vaccines at staggering rates in South Africa, over 30% more than countries in the European Union, according to recent court papers.
They are not able to defeat the COVID because of egoism, because of inequity in the distribution of vaccines. Can you imagine there are countries with 80% of the population vaccinated? In Africa, there are countries with 2% of the population vaccinated. This is totally unacceptable.
New analysis released by the United Nations Development Programme showed that only a tiny proportion of COVID-19 vaccines have been administered in developing countries, leading to a widening gap between the rich and the poor.
Almost every day, I receive calls from senior political leaders around the world asking when their country will receive their vaccines through COVAX. Some of them are frustrated, and I understand why. They see some of the world's richest countries buying enough vaccines to immunize their populations several times over, while their own countries have nothing.
The global race to find a safe and effective COVID-19 vaccine saw pharmaceutical companies exploiting the pandemic to make profits. This, according to health activists across the world. Activists and experts in the industry, often referred to as Big Pharma, were accused of prioritizing revenue over equitable access to life-saving drugs.
Pfizer has in the past come under fire from campaigners for making big profits during the pandemic, with wealthy countries buying up supplies of its COVID-19 vaccine, leaving many African nations struggling to access these vital products.
Recently, the head of UNAIDS, Winnie Byanyima, strongly criticized Big Pharma for prioritizing profits over saving lives and warned that racist inequalities are undermining progress towards ending AIDS, especially in Africa. Along with the battle against the alleged unethical conduct of big pharmaceutical companies, activists continue to wage a war against the World Trade Organization, which they say has increasingly made it difficult to lift waivers on intellectual property rules for various medications for the greater good of humankind. As millions of Africans continue to die annually of malaria, tuberculosis, and HIV-related illnesses, we ask, why are developing countries powerless against big pharmaceutical companies who continue to prioritize profits over saving human lives? For Unfiltered, I'm Skangiwe Mtiyane.
Was South Africa exploited by big pharmaceutical companies in its COVID vaccine contracts? Ms. Hassan, thank you very much for joining us. You've been engaged in a titanic legal battle to gain access to these vaccination contracts, which you've been granted by a court. Could you summarize for us briefly what you've learned through gaining access to at least some of those documents at this point?
Thanks. So the first point is that we've received 4 contracts as part of the court order disclosure. That's for Johnson & Johnson, Pfizer, the Serum Institute of India, and COVAX. We are awaiting a second batch of documents, which by agreement with the Department of Health will be handed over to us at the end of September, and that relates to other negotiation records and information. The contracts that we have and that we've analyzed, and some of the documents that are referenced in those contracts have also not been included, and we have asked for that as well. So based on what we have been given and what was shared with us as part of the court disclosure in an unredacted form, and I think that that's quite significant and important because we're likely to be the first country in the world where a court has ordered the unredacted versions of the contracts to be made publicly available. Those contracts revealed to us what we have said in the last few days, that it's characterized by the pernicious nature of pharmaceutical bullying. The contracts are extremely one-sided. There are multiple terms and conditions that basically belie the whole idea of transparency and accountability. And we can go through the different provisions and clauses, but mainly it insisted on such high levels of confidentiality and secrecy that for about 2.5 years, the public was none the wiser about what was exactly agreed to in our name for a considerable sum of public money. Estimates are anywhere between 11 to 14 billion rand, and all for the benefit of these pharmaceutical companies. So we have argued as a multi-stakeholder group of civil society organizations made up also of academics and of lawyers and of activists, so quite a broad range of stakeholders. We have said that they actually represent quite an imperial-minded set of terms and conditions on the part of these companies, and that they're actually immoral in many respects, and we can talk about why we've argued that, and that this should actually never, ever happen again, not just in any pandemic, but in dealing with any public health crisis.
Just for the benefit of our viewers, and briefly, if I may, could you give us an example of just one aspect of the inequality of these contracts that you think is particularly egregious so that we can get a practical feel?
Yeah, sure. So if you read the 4 agreements, the one that really stood out for us, well, obviously all of them stood out for us, but the one provision that has really stood out for us, and it has been regarded as the most egregious of all the clauses, and that has been the demand by Johnson & Johnson in its agreement with the South African government, where it basically barred the South African government from imposing any export restrictions. Now, the consequence of not being able to impose any export restrictions in the middle of a global pandemic at the height of the devastation in South Africa was that vaccines that were filled and finished in South Africa in the Eastern Cape were basically diverted to European customers, because in terms of Johnson & Johnson's allocation, those people were regarded as more important. So we were waiting for vaccine supplies, you'll recall, in the first 2 quarters of 2021. We were going through multiple waves of infection. We were waiting for supplies from Pfizer. But Johnson & Johnson was basically, sent about 32 million vaccines, according to the New York Times, on the basis of this particular agreement. So what it means is that it extracted a concession from the South African government, and it told them, if you didn't agree to this particular provision, we won't supply you with anything. There'll be no agreement. The minister at that time even said to Parliament it was a take it or leave it situation. But it meant that they were securing a provision in this particular contract to benefit itself in a separate second contract, when those supplies should have actually been prioritized for people in Africa.
Dr. Crisp, I suppose the question that emerges is, given the egregious and in some ways outrageous unfairness of these contracts, why did we sign them?
Yeah, thanks very much, Sizwe. Well, it was a question of whether you want to vaccinate your population or not. So that was the choice that was given to the government at the time. So if you choose not to vaccinate anybody, when there was evidence already that the vaccines were preventing severe illness and death, then for a government to take a decision not to get any vaccine would have been an extremely difficult thing to do and watch people die. So the choice was taken to accept the terms, even though, as you've seen from the clips, the president, the minister, and everybody else was indignant about it. Not much we could do at the time.
Do you condemn the pharmaceutical companies for imposing these conditions on you?
Look, obviously, we've had lots of disagreements with pharmaceutical companies during this time. We don't necessarily discuss everything that we have had to say and they have had to say to us, but it's not been a happy relationship. And our bigger concern is that, as Fatima said a moment ago, we never want to see this happen again. The question is, how do we prevent it from happening? Not in wartime, but in peacetime, now, all the time. Why should we be in this situation? And what do we do about it? And there are several options. The one is to manufacture whatever we possibly can ourselves in Africa, work together across the continent to get sufficient volumes to be able to do that. That means getting past patents and all kinds of other arrangements, or developing our own platforms for these kinds of products, specifically vaccines, or finding another way to make sure that we buy through collective global agreements. And right now there's a massive global debate through international negotiations in the World Health Organization and in the United Nations to try and protect the world from this kind of behavior in the future.
Can I ask, I think I agree with that, and I think everyone would agree with moving forward to the future, and we certainly will get into the solutions to some of these problems. Do you think that government cast enough of a critical eye on these agreements? And do you feel that we had the appropriate legal and trade capacity looking at these agreements at the time, so that whatever small bargaining power we had, we were able to wield to the full?
So I'm not sure it would have made any difference if we had any different people looking at it. I was not a member of the government at that time or a member of the department, but I certainly have been through a lot of this with my colleagues, and I worked with Minister Mkhize and subsequently with the other ministers who have had this portfolio. And there's no question that every effort was made. You heard what the president said. You've heard what the ministers are quoted as having said. I'm not sure that changing any legal teams would have made any difference to any clause. If you want to get this vaccine, you're already at the end of the queue. These are the terms. These are the conditions. And we have plenty other customers in the world. This is where we find ourselves. So, here's the dotted line. It wouldn't have made any difference whatsoever if there was different bargaining capacity. But I've no doubt that we do have plenty of skills in South Africa for this kind of thing.
Ms. Sehoma, what are your thoughts on whether we should be turning our attention to government, or whether this is completely a question of rapacious big pharma?
Thank you for that. I think it's also very important to note that, what we have experienced during COVID, I think the inequities experienced during COVID manifestations of long-term systematic injustice and structural flaws in the context of global health in general. And I think with our state, there's also just over-reliance on voluntary actions by the private sector to resolve access issues, while downplaying their own responsibilities at some point. I think we have seen practices during COVID where hoarding, and also particularly South Africa calling for patent waivers at a global level. However, none of that was, implemented in South Africa, where we even took a step to reform our patent laws. We have been calling for patent law reform for years, for over 10 years, for South Africa to change our patent laws to ensure that we get access to medicine and, safeguard public health. But none of that happened, even in the face of a crisis like COVID. Instead, we go to global stages to ask the global north, or look towards global mechanisms to make those changes, whilst we have that power to change the mechanisms in our country, and none of that happened. So, in as much as I do recognize that pharmaceuticals have a huge role to play, and they do need to be blamed for this, but at the same time, our own policy frameworks, our laws enable them to get away with this. So it's actually also upon us, and particularly the Department of Trade and Industry, it's their responsibility to also reform some of these laws to do away with these practices for pharmaceuticals.
Absolutely, and it's interesting to hear your perspectives on our domestic legal reforms and how we've in some ways dragged our feet there. But do you accept the Department of Health's position, at least now, about the contracts that, look, we could have tried our hardest, but we were basically forced to choose between the little we got or nothing?
I mean, I would understand, that it was a very difficult point to be. I do understand, but I also feel like in such exceptional moments, I think South Africa has also been quite a beacon in terms of transparency. In particular, I think we have very good practices, especially procurement practices, in terms of price transparency. I think in such exceptional times, or in times of crisis, that's actually when we need more transparency to build trust, particularly with the broader public, and ensure that accountability, because we're now going into an uncharted terrain that, we don't really know what's happening, Right. So I do understand, acknowledge, the difficulty at that time, but I do believe that there could have been that push in the same way that we do, at any point when we negotiate around contracts.
Indeed.
We negotiate with Johnson & Johnson.
Absolutely. Yeah. Let's pause the discussion. We will come back exactly on the point that you make, Ms. Sehoma. We're talking vaccine access and the extent to which South Africa was exploited by pharmaceutical companies in its contracts with those providers. We'll be back after the break to analyze whether government was derelict in its duty by keeping these contracts secret. Welcome back to Unfiltered. Was South Africa exploited in its contracts with big pharmaceutical companies around COVID contracts? We recently received a court judgment which compelled government to provide these contracts to the Health Justice Initiative. Dr. Chris, I suppose some people might be sympathetic to the point you made about the fact that these pharmaceutical companies basically could tell government, especially in the global south, to either take it or leave it. But what I do find strange is how government resisted making these contracts transparent. Do you think that government made a mistake in not providing these contracts when they were requested by civil society?
Well, Sizwe, I think Fatima answered that question a little while ago when she explained what the confidentiality clauses said. It was very clear, and we were told straight that if we voluntarily declared the contents of these contracts, then we would be taken to court. And one was in the UK and one was in the US. So if you want to go and have multi-billion rand defenses for voluntarily declaring the contents of the contracts, that's one thing. But we were busy fighting a pandemic, and since then we've been dealing with a whole range of issues. You mustn't think COVID's over. We're still very busy on a daily basis with quite a lot of issues related to COVID. The virus is still around. The people are still getting sick and admitted. We're still busy vaccinating. We're still dealing with all the millions of doses that we were obliged to then take on delivery, even after we said we don't want them anymore. We've had to dispose of them. It's been an absolute nightmare. This is something I would never, ever like to see again. But you can't go and gung-ho just open up a contract or hand it over voluntarily.
But
the
court did actually condemn your decision not to do that and said that confidentiality clauses are no barrier to the constitutional imperatives of transparency and accountability.
The court doesn't get sued by foreign governments.
So the court was wrong?
No, the court's entitled to the court's opinion. I didn't say the court was wrong. I just said our department would have had to empty our bank accounts to pay for the legal fees to defend ourselves in foreign countries, because we would definitely have been sued. So the court is entitled to the court's opinion, and we honor that. We respect the courts of the country, and they are welcome to chastise us. But we had to take a decision about whether we thought it would be valid. We got opinions about whether we would be able to defend ourselves in foreign territories, and we were told we wouldn't be able to.
I suppose just lastly on this, and before I bring in the other panelists, let's accept that for the moment. What I think is also maybe quite disturbing is how long it took to even give a response when you were requested to disclose the information. I think the Health Justice Initiative was waiting for 6 months, just waiting to know whether you were going to do it or not. So I think it's one thing, okay, to suggest that there was going to be cost on the other side, but to delay for 6 months, that seems quite excessive.
Well, in terms of the size and the number of court cases we deal with, that's pretty much the norm. So whether it's administratively acceptable or not, it's a reality we deal with. Unfortunately, we have people who did not want to be vaccinated who have taken us to court. The people who wanted to be vaccinated who took us to court. The people who didn't want other people to be vaccinated who took us to court. So we are dealing with a whole range of court cases related to just the COVID incident. And the way in which it works in government is you first decide if you want to defend or not defend, then you approach the state attorneys to get counsels appointed. Counsels are busy with other cases, they work on schedules, you have to wait for them to be available, then you brief them. These things don't happen in a week or 3 days or short-term spaces of time.
Okay.
And this was a particularly landmark issue, as you've heard. So I think it was a reasonable time frame to us to have got advice.
Ms. Hassan, your views on government's response to your court action and the extent to which transparency, at least the court suggests, was inappropriately withheld?
So look, I think there's, obviously larger systemic issues, and I'd like to go into that. The only silver lining in this case was the minister's decision in the last few weeks not to appeal the judgment and to actually hand over the documents. And I think for that we must applaud the department and its legal representatives. And I think, I do agree with Nick on one part. I may not often agree with him. But the part around the jurisdictions that were used for the signing of these agreements and contracts, there were multiple jurisdictions that these companies, as well as COVAX, which is administered by Gavi, insisted upon. So there's different sets of rules, different jurisdictions for contracts that are actually signed in South Africa using public money. So when we talk about the systemic abuse, the systemic exploitation, this is what we mean. It's about the jurisdiction which these contracts are being governed by. It's the terms and conditions that they are insisting upon in the middle of a pandemic, taking advantage of countries in the global south and their vulnerability. Now, when I use the word vulnerability, these were not terms and conditions that they demanded of global north countries. The export restriction clause was not, required of the US government or the EU, but it was of global south countries in Latin America and also in Africa. And so your earlier point about whether we were the only country in the world who had to agree to this, no, unfortunately not. many countries in the global south. In Latin America, the dispute around the terms and conditions meant that there was about a 6 to 8 month delay in the delivery of vaccines. In 2 countries in Latin America, they couldn't even sign the agreement because these companies demanded full indemnification. And in at least 2 Latin American countries, they even demanded national assets to be put on the table as surety for the payment of these particular contracts. So I think it goes to a systemic issue.
Was that something we actually managed to avoid, the surety question?
Well, we successfully mitigated against the surety demand, and that's because the minister at that time made that public, and there was a lot of negative publicity. But we weren't unable to escape the clauses on the full indemnification against all forms of liability. We had to set up, you'll recall, a rapid vaccine injury compensation fund, without which these companies would not deliver a single dose of a vaccine. All of this, taking place within a context where the companies were also refusing to share the technology. There were companies in the global south who would have been able to manufacture these vaccines and roll it out globally, in the quantities that we needed, but they were demanding what we call in a set of ransom negotiations, terms and conditions in these contracts, and refusing to share the technology at the same time. So combined cumulatively, I think you see the pernicious power that we've talked about in our analysis.
Ms. Sehoma, how do you intervene in this debate about government and its decision to conceal the contracts and the extent to which it should have been more transparent about these terms to the South African public, or could have been?
Yeah, no, I think for me, I would also just take it to a more global level at this point to say, obviously at that point, working on a more global context to say, at this point, there are discussions around pandemic preparedness. How do we better, prepare for the next pandemic? And I think this would be very important that in these discussions, in this treaty, that we have legally binding mechanisms that would ensure, public interest and should ensure that national laws are strengthened to provide, legal support for governments who reject claims of non-disclosure and confidentiality. So I think in the global context, I think there should be a strengthening of those mechanisms to ensure that governments are not, put in a corner to accept such conditions from pharmaceuticals.
Indeed, and we will continue this conversation again after the break. We're going to come to some of the questions that you have all raised as panelists in terms of the wider context, especially around the intersection of trade and questions of government procurement when it comes to vaccines. And then we'll move our conversation towards the solutions thereafter. But stick with us as we delve into the deeper global trends which have shaped the way that vaccine contracts in South Africa were crafted. Welcome back to Unfiltered. We're inquiring into the COVID-19 vaccine contracts which government signed, in many ways under pressure from pharmaceutical companies who told them to take it or leave it. Did South Africa get a raw deal? Could we have got a better deal? Or is this just a question of big pharma being rapacious? Our conversation so far is focused on the recent court judgment which has compelled disclosure, at least to the Health Justice Initiative, on some of these contracts. Ms. Sehoma, can I start with you? To what extent do you think the problems in these COVID contracts that are starting to surface reveal deeper problems in the way that wider healthcare procurement in South Africa is undertaken?
Yeah, I think as I've mentioned that it's a very systematic problem that we're dealing with. This is something that we've seen with access or challenges to access ARVs, challenges to access TB medicine, cancer medicine, and you can name all diseases. So it's a common occurrence which is very systematic. And I think one of the issues that we're actually dealing with now is on access to TB medicine, particularly bedaquiline, which is a DRTB medicine. And what we're seeing, similar to what we've seen with COVID-19 contract, is that Johnson & Johnson, again, is charging South Africa way much more or double the amount than what they are charging the rest of the world. So currently, South Africa recently actually concluded a contract with Johnson & Johnson to procure DRTB drug bedaquiline, and Johnson & Johnson is charging us 5,517 Rand for a 6-month regimen of bedaquiline, whereas they are pricing or charging the Global Drug Facility half of that. So currently the Global Drug Facility gets access to bedaquiline for 2,455, if I'm not mistaken. So, it's also due to, excessive pricing practices that we are seeing, but also because of exclusionary patents. And I think also with our current system, patent system that is not reform allows for them to be able to do that. So it's not an uncommon practice, and unfortunately, until we actually stand up and reform some of our laws, some of our frameworks, we are going to continue facing these big giants and getting them to milk, a lot of the money, taxpayer money at that, from South Africans.
Ms. Hassan, how do you respond to that and the wider question of whether these contracts reveal a much deeper problem with the way that South Africa actually enters into this whole landscape of intellectual property and how it intersects with the healthcare industry?
I'm glad you've mentioned intellectual property, because I think that's the elephant in the room, right? So if we take a few steps back, the way in which pharmaceutical corporations, who, by the way, are unelected, the CEOs, have no duty or accountability to us in that respect. So in many respects, it's quite undemocratic processes. But what they are able to do is to exert their power in contracting, where they can demand the terms and conditions that they do, whether it's in COVID or on HIV or on TB, and particularly in relation to price, because that power is derived from exclusive monopolies that they obtain through what we call patent protections. So if a country gives you an exclusive monopoly for 20 years and you're the only company that can manufacture a particular drug, or in the case of COVID, those particular COVID vaccines, because there was no intellectual property waiver. And by the way, our government could have issued a compulsory license, but it refused to do that for 3 years, even in the pandemic. So there is also a combination of government fear of trade sanctions. We saw that with HIV/AIDS. We saw that when President Mandela decided to take on the industry, what happened about being put on trade watch list. So that power comes from the ability to exercise a patent, and that patent gives you exclusivity, and that exclusivity gives you power, and that power allows you to dictate price and to dictate the terms and conditions of particular agreements. We're seeing that now with HIV, because there wasn't significant pushback on these secret COVID contracts and the onerous terms and conditions, where companies are trying to insist on non-disclosure agreements even for HIV medicines. So much so that MSF, as a humanitarian organization, has even refused to sign an agreement with the leading HIV prevention manufacturer because they're insisting on an NDA. So the question really has to be, who gave these companies this power to be able to demand non-disclosure agreements when you're trying to address a major crisis such as HIV or COVID? I mean, there's something significantly wrong with the way in which the world trade rules are designed. You had this in your introductory insert about the battle that we are having as medicine activists with intellectual property rules that continue giving excessive power to these pharmaceutical corporations. And that's why today's announcement by the Competition Commission that it's going to be launching an investigation into Johnson & Johnson, not just on its price of a particular TB drug, but on its patenting strategy, which what we as activists call evergreening, where you try and extend the monopoly beyond the first 20 years of protection, I think is groundbreaking and significant. It's the first case we believe that the Commission will be investigating the conduct of a company in evergreening its patents in South Africa. And I think that potentially will create quite a significant precedent. Will it create enough a concern or a sanction for these companies when they're making billions in profits, when we've had 40 COVID billionaires in the space of 2 years, individuals, when we've had companies basically making $1,000 profit per second? We're not sure, because whatever penalty the Competition Commission imposes, that probably will be quite small change for companies such as J&J. And can I just lastly add, Sizwe, that as a human rights activist who's worked on HIV, on TB, on COVID, I think it's cowardly of these pharmaceutical companies not to agree to any of these media interviews. It is, for companies that insisted on the amount of money that we had to spend in these COVID contracts, on the terms and conditions. I mean, firstly, they owe our country an apology. Secondly, I think they owe us some significant refunds. But thirdly, they should actually be held to account. And I mean, we really hope that Parliament actually summons all of their CEOs for quite a significant inquiry.
Well, we live in eternal hope, and I can't express how important it is for that kind of accountability. And in this case, state accountability seems to be more available than corporate accountability. So, indeed, important point. Dr. Crisp, the wider questions that this reveals, and you also alluded earlier to our own internal capacity to produce these life-saving medical interventions or vaccines. What do you think we need to do to prevent this in future? Because there's no doubt that this problem is not going to, as you already said, it's not just a COVID problem, but it's not going to disappear in future. It may, in fact, intensify.
Yeah, sure. So, look, I think you've heard some of the lessons that we've learned out of this, and some of the things we knew before and perhaps didn't act on, and now are extremely angry and will do more to act on. But it has to be done. It can't be one country, and it can't be one small country sitting down in the south of Africa. We have to do this en bloc and as a large bloc. So we have, as you know, relationships with BRICS, we have relationships with SADC, we have AU relationships and other friends around the world. So the question is, how do we form relationships with these various blocs to stand up and make sure that we are not dealt with as second-class citizens next time, well, whenever, at any point, anywhere in the way we provide our healthcare services. So that you heard references to a legally binding agreement. Now, there are obviously countries who do not believe in a legally binding agreement. So that's the relationship that has to be tackled at the global level in the WHO and other forums. And that we have a position in South Africa where we stand firm, that we believe in a legally binding agreement. We believe in equity, and we are pushing a very strong equity slant in all of these discussions. But we work with others. We have allies. We have people that we rely on for other facets of what we do, and we need to bring them along in our thinking. So these are not discussions that are done in 1 or 2 meetings. There are meetings about meetings about meetings, and they go backwards and forwards as people revise words. But while that is going on, we are also busy in the various forums, again, globally and in Africa and here in the country, on pandemic preparedness. So pandemics can take many forms. It won't necessarily be a respiratory virus next time. And we need to understand what kind of measures did we not have in place this past time. And as you said, my portfolio is national health insurance. One of the things we learned is that countries that have single systems, where everybody is already working together with single digital systems, data sharing, procurement is done in a more coordinated manner, laboratories work in a more facilitated manner, we're able to respond quicker. We were lucky. We had a national health laboratory service that was able to gear up quickly, and we were able to work with the private laboratory services. We were able to get our digital service systems, which were already in evolution for NHI, and repurpose them very quickly with no further budget to deal with the electronic vaccine delivery system. So we can't be caught with our pants down again. We've got to have all these various mechanisms in place, including research, manufacturing vaccines, ability to make diagnoses quickly, to share data, to prevent our neighbors and others from locking borders when it's inappropriate to lock borders, etc., etc., etc. So that's what we're busy with now.
And indeed, we'll come back in the final segment to chart the way forward some more. We're discussing South Africa's COVID vaccine contracts and the extent to which those were exploitative, whose fault that was, and what can be done to avert that situation in future. Join us after the break as we conclude and wrap up our conversation. Welcome back to Unfiltered. We're talking the COVID vaccine contracts that South Africa was made to sign by pharmaceutical companies and what that reveals about the deeper inequalities in global health, but also some of the oversights of the South African state itself. We're going to come to some of the comments on social media, and let's have a look at what you've had to say about our conversation. Mzuvukile says, the bad attitude of those pharma toward Africa reminds me of incidents when many people, if not millions, were killed in Rwanda. The UN turned a blind eye, but they pay attention to the war in Bosnia. They only see Africa as a place for beneficially, not for help. And let's turn to another comment. Clinton says, so there were no backhands? ? Let's then come back to our conversation, and I suppose there are also some responses that could be offered from our panel to those social media comments. Ms. Hassan, any thoughts about questions of corruption? Because one does shudder a bit when you think of NDAs and massive amounts exchanging hands and what that could mean given South Africa's history of corruption.
Yeah, I mean, we certainly approached this case not on the basis that there was any sort of allegations of wrongdoing. For us, the question was the obligation on the companies to make the terms and conditions open, and the only way in which we could do that was to use South Africa's access to information laws, because we're lucky we have that. In other countries, they don't. And the only way that we could do it, because we have this fantastic constitution, is to actually sue the National Department of Health. And I think you're right, they resisted for 2 years. Nicholas has explained why. And in that process, once the court actually ordered the disclosure, which actually does not breach the terms and conditions of the agreements, because it does permit for the disclosure when there is a court order, that's when the contracts were made available. But I should tell you a little anecdote, is that quite early on in the case is where we asked all of these different companies, the local officers or the officers that we could find in email off the internet, who were the contracting parties? What's the legal address for us to serve papers on them? And even that information was refused. So how are you putting 11 billion rand on the table to secure life-saving vaccines in the middle of a pandemic? And Pfizer wrote back to us and said, even that information is confidential, let alone the contract, but the actual contracting parties and their details, which is why we couldn't actually serve papers on them, and the action just proceeded against the Department of Health. And that's very dangerous levels of secrecies, which can't happen under national health insurance, and certainly shouldn't happen in the next pandemic or epidemic, and these companies really have to answer for that. In respect of Africa being ignored, I totally agree. When the 30 million J&J vaccines were leaving our shores, at that point in Africa, only 2% of people were being vaccinated. The World Health Organization's DG at the time kept on reminding the world that this is a moral failure. Many people, including Nobel laureates, including the UN Secretary General, called it vaccine nationalism and vaccine apartheid. So I think people in Africa genuinely, it's a genuine and legitimate feeling. Because we were actually, as Nicholas said earlier, at the back of the queue, and we were told, we'll come to you one day, and even if we don't, there'll be no penalty. And even if we don't bring you the necessary supplies, you're going to have to be liable for a percentage of the advance payment. I really would urge everybody to actually read these contracts. They're on the Health Justice website. Because if you want a lesson in how power operates in the middle of a pandemic, in a global health context, they are so illuminating, and they will also, I think, enrage you, and hopefully you'll all join us in our struggles for greater transparency and accountability going forward. Which brings me to my last point, Sizwe. Next week and the weeks after that, there's, big global meetings at the UN. It's called the UN General Assembly. There's going to be discussions around pandemic preparedness, around pandemic accords. But what's really significant is the same type of lobbying we saw during COVID to block the TRIPS waiver that South Africa and India had been leading, particularly by pharmaceutical companies, because they were concerned about what that would mean for their bottom line and their profits. There are now efforts currently underway to try and dilute the text that talks about transparency of two things: pricing, which is what we didn't have in South Africa up until these contracts were open, and the terms and conditions. So if you can't agree on having that language in a global pandemic accord, then I think we're all in some serious trouble.
Right, absolutely. Thanks for responding to those social media comments. Ms. Sehoma, can I ask you, you've alluded a lot to our own domestic legal arrangements when it comes to patents. Can you elaborate further on how we could change our domestic legal situation to mitigate against some of the risks we've seen from these COVID contracts or other similar?
No, I think one important thing that we would need to do going forward is also attaching access conditions to some of these mechanisms or agreements that we enter into, as also our policy frameworks. There's a lot of contribution. I think it's very important to highlight. There's a lot of contribution, even in the development. I think Dr. Nicholas Chris mentioned, the need for developing our own manufacturing capacities, research and development. But what would be important, even with that, is that we attach conditions, because we put funding, there's a lot of contribution, financial contributions that go into that. But even with clinical trials that we host in South Africa, we hosted a lot of clinical trials during COVID. However, we do not see a return on investment to that. Therefore, it would be very important to attach access to, benefit sharing conditions to some of these policies on clinical trials, on research and development, even reforming our patent laws. So I think it would be very important that we leverage, even in our contribution, really recognize that it's not just the global north. It's not just Johnson & Johnson developing these groundbreaking vaccines. We all have a role to play. We've all contributed in this, and it's only fair for us to actually benefit from that. And that will only happen is if we, have frameworks, we have policies that enable us, that allow us to leverage off those contributions that we make as a country. So I think it's very important to look at clinical trial, and I think also just transparency in terms of the contributions and the funding that we make in this is also very important to hold, for the sake to ensure accountability, but to also ensure that our contributions are also accounted for.
Dr. Crisp, one of the solutions that has been proposed from the state is developing our own pharmaceutical production capacity. But that has really been a pipe dream for the last, I think, 10 years. We really haven't moved on that. So to some extent, we also haven't done the admittedly relatively smaller things. It's not going to change global health politics to secure what little independence we can to get ourselves out of these crises.
Yeah, so again, there's lots of angles to that, Sizwe. So if the model is to create pharmaceutical capacity by destroying the pharmaceutical manufacturing capacity of other companies that are already in South Africa, then it's not an advantage at all. And if it's pharmaceutical capacity that still involves the bringing in into the country of the active pharmaceutical ingredients, and only doing the filling and finishing and packaging and labeling in the country, then we really haven't advanced anything at all. And you need scale to be able to compete. India produces for well over 1 billion people in their own country, and then they are producing for export. We are talking about producing for 60 million people. We're dreaming. You have to produce for Africa, and you can't do it alone. You have to do it with other partners. You have to merge. You have to integrate what you are doing. So it doesn't help you set up a company in Pretoria that's going to collapse a company in Gqeberha or in eThekwini. You have to have a better model than that. And unfortunately, the initial model that we saw for setting up the state-owned company was based on guaranteed what they call takeoffs of volumes, huge volumes of antiretrovirals. So you would be bound to one company in one place, in one country, and what happens if something goes wrong in the manufacturing process? We never do that. We always buy from several different providers so that we, not having all our eggs in one basket, we spread the risk. And I'm talking now in the public sector, of course. The private sector purchases in a different way using a single exit price. But I'm talking for big public health programs with the vaccines and the big medicines. So the dynamics of setting up a state-owned pharmaceutical company are not simple. And the question also is, who's going to own the shares? Is it owned by the state? Is it owned by a government company? Is it owned by individuals who own the larger portion of the shares and the state's only a part owner? What are the structures of these companies? So until those things are clear, I think we are not going to get any closer, but we definitely do need to make sure that we work en bloc in Africa collectively. Otherwise, we are going to be back in this position in the time going ahead.
Thank you very much for joining me on this discussion, to all the panelists. Ms. Hassan, can I just confirm that those contracts are available on your website? Is that what you alluded to earlier? Right, and when you get the further tranche of documents on the 29th of September, those will also be publicly available?
Yes.
Very good, thank you. Well, we wait with bated breath. Thank you very much to all of you for your insights on tonight's discussion. We really appreciate the time. And thank you very much for joining us for this fascinating exploration into the COVID-19 contracts that the South African government signed using our money, outrageous and egregious, unfair contracts that we were forced to sign. In some ways, Big Pharma proving the stereotype of its rapacity. Let's continue this conversation on social media, and don't forget to join us for the next installment of Unfiltered News, Unfiltered Views, and Unfiltered Conversations.